So in getting started with the Web API, I wanted to set some ground rules so you understand what we're building and how we're building it. First of all, we're building a whole API. I'm going to be building as much of it in front of you as I can, and where I don't actually build the code in front of you, I'll talk to you about it very specifically about that we've added this in what way. But we're only building the API. We're not building the database or the data layer in this course. We're going to be using a pre-built one using the entity framework, but all the concepts we're going to talk about are going to be true whether you're using Raven or Couch or SQL Server or raw ADO.NET. It doesn't matter how you're getting your data. The concepts for building the API itself are going to be the same. We're not building a website to support the API either. That's going to be a separate operation and the same sort of standard web development techniques you can see in other courses, both mine and others here in Pluralsight. We're simply about building that API. And we're not building the client-side code. You're not going to see us build JavaScript or other clients to interact with the API. We're going to be doing some testing interactively to show you things that work with tools like the browser or things like Fiddler in order to show the API working, but we're not going to build that code itself. We're trying to stay focused on just building the code that is required to expose an API. What we're doing requires Visual Studio 2010 and above. We're going to be using Visual Studio 2012, but it will work with older versions of Visual Studio as well as newer versions of Visual Studio. As of the writing of this course, Visual Studio 2013 is out as a preview, but because it isn't done, we've decided to use 2012 as the platform. If you do use Visual Studio 2010, you will probably have to manually install ASP.NET MVC4 in order to get the ability to include Web API into your projects. Again, Web API requires .NET 4 and above, so any of the techniques about adding it to your existing project you're going to see aren't going to work if you're not already using .NET 4 or above. .NET 4.5 added support for async. We're not going to be doing a lot with async, but understanding that you'll get the most out of Web API if you are using .NET 4.5 or above. And before we get started, I do want to talk a little bit about the data we're going to be working with. The shape of the data we're looking at is really threefold. There's three types of data we're going to be dealing with. We have the notion of a food, and this is a description of a certain food. Might it be butter or milk or steak? And then a measure of that food, and each food can have multiple measures. So we might have a pat of butter or a pound of butter. We may have 1 ounce of steak or we may have an 8-ounce steak. So that within each food there's going to be different measures that have nutritional information. How many calories, how much protein, etc. For individual users, we're going to have the notion of a diary. And a diary is what food I'm eating on a particular day. You can probably see where this is going, where we're going to be building an API that allows people to count calories. And in the diary itself, we just have who owns it and what the current date is. Within that diary, there's going to be one or more diary entries, and each of these diary entries has a relationship to a food and a measure within that food. So that a diary entry is going to say, I had 3 pats of butter, I had 1 8-ounce glass of milk, whatever it may be, so that we can, in the diary, compute what their nutritional information is for the day. Those 4 tables themselves are put together to represent the data that we're going to be exposing through the API. We've also got 2 sets of data that are about security that we're going to get to in Module 3. The first is API user. This is someone who is registered with our service in order to use the API. And so we have an app ID and a secret that the API user has been handed that they're going to use to authenticate into our system. Then we have this notion of auth tokens. And these are tokens that are handed out as API users request a token with a certain expiration. So they can use a token for so many method calls until the expiration hits, and then they're going to have to request a new token. But again, we'll talk about how that works, but those 2 pieces of data are specific to security, whereas food, measure, diary, and diary entries are about the actual data we're going to expose through our fairly simple API. Let's get building.